Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Eclipses in History podcast. If you're here, it is because you're excited by astronomy, science, and history. So, today we're going to tell a very interesting story. It is about a 15-year war that was fought between the Lydians and the Medes. It was in Turkey, it was in ancient times and it was suddenly terminated due to a total solar eclipse, which was interpreted as a sign from the gods that the battle should be interrupted. And then both sides stopped fighting. And at those times, societies believed in several gods. And so they believed that it was the god's will that the fight should stop. And the famous philosopher Thales of Miletus was supposed to have predicted that eclipse, but we are going to see that our today's guest is going to discuss that Thales of Miletus could not have the scientific knowledge to know that that eclipse would take place at that time. So we're going to see today, we're going to interview Dr. Miguel Queredeta. He's an astrophysicist from Spain. So welcome today, Dr. Miguel Queredeta. I hope you're going to enjoy being with us today and that our viewers will also enjoy being with you and listening to your so interesting comments on this so interesting, exciting eclipse. So, Dr. Miguel Queredeta, let's go to our first question. But first of all, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here.
And now let's move to our first question, Dr. Miguel. Can you discuss who was Thales of Miletus and why was he well known in antiquity?
Thales of Miletus was one of the greatest minds of antiquity. He is a so-called pre-Socratic philosopher, which means that he lived before Socrates between the 7th and 6th century BC. And in those early times, philosophy and science were practically indistinguishable. They were almost the same thing, as they both made the first early rational attempts to try and understand the world around us. In this context, Thales put forward an important hypothesis, and that is that everything in nature can be ultimately reduced to a final principle, to a single element. And he argued that this element should be water. This idea could seem a bit silly or naive to us these days, but bear in mind, we now believe that life on Earth would not exist the way we know it if it weren't for the molecule H2O, water. Thales, in addition to proposing this ultimate principle that the Greeks called arche, also made important contributions to fields such as mathematics, and from a very practical perspective. At some point, he was traveling in Egypt and he was mesmerized by the pyramids. He wondered if he could somehow measure their height and came up with a very clever idea on how to do this. He used the shadow of the pyramids to deduce their height. He set a vertical stick on the ground on a sunny day and measured the length of the shadow cast by the stick. He argued on mathematical grounds geometrically that the proportion between the shadow of the stick and its length would be the same as the proportion between the shadow of the pyramid and its height. Like this, he could correctly deduce how tall the pyramids were. This is just an example of the many contributions of Thales to early science and philosophy. In fact, Thales was known as one of the 7 sages of antiquity, so his wisdom was well appreciated back then.
Very interesting, Dr. Miguel. Now let's move to our next question, which is, can you discuss how Thales of Miletus predicted that eclipse? If he did predict the eclipse, where did he obtain the scientific knowledge for that?
The short answer is no. I don't think that Thales could predict the eclipse, at least the way we understand scientific predictions these days. It is often claimed that Thales could have had access to Babylonian knowledge on eclipse prediction and applied it to this particular eclipse. However, Babylonians themselves were not able to predict eclipses like this one, this kind of solar eclipses, as early as the beginning of the 6th century BC. It was not until a few centuries later that they developed the cycles necessary to be able to predict eclipses accurately. In any case, independently from how far Babylonians were in terms of eclipse prediction at those times, it turns out that none of the cycles that Thales could have used to predict this eclipse were applicable in this particular case. This is something that I showed in a paper that I published a few years ago. It turns out that none of the cycles used to predict eclipses yield a good probability in this case for this prediction of a solar eclipse, or the preceding eclipses were simply not visible from this area, so it was not applicable in this particular case. It has often been argued that he could have used the Saros cycle, which Babylonians themselves used a few centuries later to predict lunar eclipses. However, it is very different to predict a lunar or a solar eclipse. In a lunar eclipse, the moon is visible from the entire half of the Earth that is facing the moon, as long as it is not cloudy. However, a solar eclipse is restricted to a relatively small area on the surface of the Earth. In particular, the Saros cycle implies a shift of around 120 degrees in the path of a solar eclipse in terms of longitude, terrestrial longitude. So if I see an eclipse today here, the chances are very high that one Saros cycle later, the solar eclipse that is going to take place is not going to be visible from here. It's going to be shifted in longitude by 120 degrees. We may realize that 3 times 120 is 360, so 3 Saros cycles after a given eclipse, another eclipse is going to happen very close to the original one, because 360 degrees is a whole loop around the Earth. This is the so-called triple Saros or Eclipses cycle, which has also been claimed that possibly Thales could have used. However, in this very particular case, the local circumstances of this eclipse implied that the previous eclipse in the Eclipses cycle was not visible at all from Eastern Europe, not from Miletus, not from Anatolia. The eclipse took place over the Americas and Atlantic Ocean, so definitely Thales could not have had access to records listing those eclipses and therefore extrapolating them forward by 54 years and a few days to predict the eclipse of the year 585 BC. Summing up, I believe that the most likely thing is that the prediction of Thales is just a posterior attribution, which is not surprising. Everyone knew that Thales was very knowledgeable and he had worked on astronomy, so someone at some point perhaps said, you know, Thales could have predicted the eclipse, and then later on in time, Herodotus ended up writing that he did predict the eclipse. Or perhaps Thales simply announced the possibility of an eclipse on that day based on eclipse seasons, which were definitely known back then, and an eclipse happened. So people later changed this "an eclipse could happen" by "an eclipse will happen," making it a prediction.
That's it, Dr. Miguel. Now, our viewers would also like to know if you can give us more details on the Battle of Eclipse story.
Of course, to understand the battle eclipse a bit better, we have to travel back in time to the beginning of the 6th century BC and place ourselves in the peninsula of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. At that point, a war was going on between two groups of people, the Medes and the Lydians, some coming from the west, some coming from the east, and they were fighting over the hegemony on this land. Precisely on the 28th of May 585 BC, they were fighting, there was a battle going on next to the Halys River, which is a very long river that crosses the whole of Turkey. And suddenly, as the sun was already starting to go down in the late afternoon, the day was suddenly turned to night. These are the words that Herodotus used, a famous historian, to describe what happened in the middle of the battlefield. The sun got dark and both parties were very scared. They interpreted this as a bad omen, as a sign from the gods that they were not happy with this war. So both sides decided to very quickly sign a peace treaty. In that sense, we can claim that this eclipse really put an end to a long war, a war that lasted already more than 5 years. Modern calculations show that indeed a total solar eclipse swept over parts of Anatolia and particularly crossed an area where it seems very plausible that the battle was taking place, next to the Halys River. The totality lasted for more than 6 minutes in the center of the totality path, making it a particularly long solar eclipse. So we can imagine that indeed it had a very profound impression. It made a very big impression on both sides. Most of those soldiers had probably never seen an eclipse before. Maybe they had not even heard of the existence of eclipses, so they were probably very frightened by this happening.
That's excellent, Dr. Miguel. Now, can you please also tell us more about the interpretation of eclipses as signals of gods that something should be done, such as interrupting wars? Were there other interpretations of what an eclipse meant?
Even in ancient times, there were different interpretations of what eclipses meant in different areas and in different times. For example, in early times, Babylonians tended to interpret lunar eclipses as bad omens. The moon suddenly turning red, the color of blood, was regarded as a sign from the gods that something negative was happening. It had very negative connotations. However, as eclipse prediction became possible in later times in Babylonia, very often eclipses were interpreted as something positive, as a positive sign. When a given astrologer made the calculation that an eclipse was going to happen with the moon in a certain constellation next to a given planet, and under some circumstances these were seen as positive signs from the gods that were about to bring good luck to a given king. In China, on the other hand, eclipses, solar eclipses, were seen as the result of a dragon eating the sun. A dragon was very hungry to the point that he went and ate the sun, making it disappear. So what the Chinese did was to make a lot of noise. They played the drums, they screamed, so that the dragon would be frightened, would be scared, and would give us back the sun, which of course is what happened a few minutes later when the totality of the eclipse was over. These are just some examples of the different interpretations of eclipses in different geographical locations in ancient times.
That's so interesting, Dr. Miguel. Now, can you tell us, is the story of Tales of Miletus the only one in history of an eclipse that interrupted a war?
This is probably the most spectacular case of an eclipse bringing an end to a war. But there are other instances in history of eclipses which have had some kind of influence on a battle or a specific war. For example, in the framework of the Peloponnesian Wars, there was a battle going on in Syracuse, in modern-day Sicily, in the south of Italy, and the Athenian general, Nicias, was suddenly very scared because he saw a total lunar eclipse. He quickly asked his astrologers for advice, and they interpreted this as a negative sign, as a bad omen, and recommended that he should remain there for several weeks, for almost a month. That's what he did. He didn't move for a single month with his ships, and his enemies basically took this as an advantage, so that they badly defeated the Athenian soldiers, taking this advantage as a consequence of the superstitions of the Athenian general. It is also said that Alexander the Great at some point used a lunar eclipse to his benefit because he knew that it was going to happen, whereas his opponents did not know about it, and they were very scared. So the battle that took place the day after this lunar eclipse was decisive for the triumph of Alexander over his Persian enemies.
That's so exciting to know this, Dr. Miguel. Now, can you also tell us what lessons can students all around the world learn from this eclipse story?
I think there are several lessons that we can extract from this story. First of all, we can realize that there is a profound connection between humans and celestial phenomena that spans several millennia. We are still mesmerized by lunar or solar eclipses the same way that our ancestors were several millennia ago. However, in the ancient times, eclipses were regarded from a superstitious perspective with connotations associated with messages from the gods or astrological signs, whereas nowadays we understand them from a scientific point of view. We know that they are the result of cosmic shadows that result from the mechanics of the solar system. A second lesson that we can extract specifically from the eclipse of Thales is the fact that we should generally not take for granted what we are told. So let me explain this. Many scholars and many books have assumed that Thales predicted the eclipse simply because Herodotus told us so. However, Herodotus wrote more than 100 years after Thales lived, so definitely they could not meet. Herodotus could not witness this battle or this eclipse, and he had to rely on indirect sources, making it plausible that this was just an attribution, and Thales definitely did not predict this eclipse. But from our modern perspective, we should remain reasonably skeptical and try to always double check. This is a lesson that I think we can extract from here.
Thank you, Dr. Miguel. Now, can you also tell us how were solar and lunar eclipses predicted in ancient times?
The earliest attempts to predict eclipses were limited to announcing in which periods of the year eclipses were possible. Now we know that eclipses happen when there is an alignment in space of the Sun, the Moon and the Earth. And we can wonder, if this is the case, why don't we see eclipses every new moon or every full moon? The answer is that the plane of the orbit of the Moon around the Earth is tilted, it is inclined by about 5 degrees with respect to the ecliptic, which is the plane that describes the motion of the Earth around the Sun. As a consequence, most full moons or new moons happen slightly too high or slightly too low for an eclipse to take place. And only twice per year, in two relatively short periods of time of about 1 month each, are eclipses possible, when full moon or new moon happen sufficiently close to the ecliptic. These periods of time were already identified early on by ancient civilizations, and therefore they could predict exactly which days of the year carried the possibility of an eclipse, just the full moons or new moons that fall within these two periods that we call eclipse seasons. Eclipse predictions proper developed only a few centuries later. In the case of Babylonians, we believe around the 4th or 3rd century BC, when they realized that eclipses repeat themselves cyclically. They follow certain interwoven patterns of repetition, among which the Saros cycle stands out. The Saros is a period of time of 18 years, 10 or 11 days and a few hours, around 8 hours, after which a given eclipse of very similar characteristics will repeat itself. So, if I see a lunar total eclipse today, it is very likely that 18 years, 10 or 11 days and a few hours later, I will see a very similar lunar eclipse again. So these are the kind of mechanisms that over time developed to allow people to predict eclipses.
That's very interesting, Dr. Miguel. Now, can you also tell our viewers why didn't common citizens know the basic mechanisms for eclipses in ancient times?
In ancient times, there was a big gap between a few privileged who had access to scientific knowledge and general society who was generally not instructed on these matters. Things are very different nowadays. We have reasonably widespread education, we have access to the internet, which provides us with a lot of information, documentaries, podcasts, and so on, which makes science very accessible to general society. Specifically regarding the mechanisms that lead to the production of eclipses, these were not really fully understood in ancient times until quite late. In fact, if we go back to the times of Thales, people thought that the Earth was perfectly flat. Thales himself thought that the Earth was a flat disk, and he did suspect, though, that what we see when we see a lunar eclipse, it's the shadow of this disk projected onto space. However, they could not still suspect the fact that the Earth was a sphere and that everything is orbiting in the solar system.
Thank you, Dr. Miguel. Can you also tell us what do you think the future of eclipse observations will be like?
I think we will get to see different kinds of eclipses. So nowadays, in addition to lunar or solar eclipses, we can also observe, for example, the eclipse of one star passing in front of another in a binary system. If a binary stellar system has an orbit which is aligned with our line of sight, we can periodically measure a dip in the amount of light that we receive from this system because one of the stars has part of its surface blocked by the other one. The study of these luminosity curves as a function of time allows us to understand a lot about the dynamics of these stellar systems. Since a few decades ago, we can also see the eclipses produced by planets orbiting around other stars. When an exoplanet goes right in front of a star along our line of sight, we can measure a tiny diminishment in the brightness of the star, which is a direct evidence of the presence of a planet orbiting around it. This is the so-called transit method to detect exoplanets, which is one of the most successful ones that we have. And I think in the future, these kinds of eclipse measurements will become more and more widespread and also more and more precise. And if I am allowed to dream a little bit, I would say that maybe in the future we even get to see eclipses produced by other objects, such as black holes. Imagine what would happen if a star passes right behind a black hole along our line of sight. We would see it suddenly disappear, and it would disappear behind an object that we cannot see at all because the black hole swallows even light. It would be really fascinating. Future will tell if this will be the case, but I firmly believe that eclipses will keep playing a pivotal role in the astrophysics of the future.
That's so interesting, Dr. Miguel. Our final question is, what message would you like to share with students interested in astronomy who are watching us?
Astronomy has a unique power to give us perspective. By looking at the stars, we realize how small our little planet Earth is compared to the universe, and this teaches us that we should be humble. I think it has also a big potential for international cooperation and to bring peace to the world because the whole humanity shares a common sky. Astronomy is a fascinating subject to study from a scientific point of view, at least from my own experience, and I think it is very accessible nowadays to society through documentaries, outreach and information on the internet, and it's something that connects us with our ancestors who were also fascinated by heavenly phenomena, and which also gives us a very special connection with the cosmos around us.
Very good, Dr. Miguel. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm sure that your participation here has inspired students, general public, our viewers all around the world who are excited about astronomy, eclipses, eclipse story, which is a very interesting topic because many people know about eclipses, but not so many know that eclipses have changed so many historical events, and the battle of eclipse is something so interesting because two people were fighting and it was interrupted due to a solar eclipse. So it's something so different, it's something so unique, and your responses here were so enriching. So thank you very much for being here and sharing your so exciting knowledge with our viewers. Thank you very much, Dr. Miguel.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Hi, I'm David Sybeck, an astrophysicist in the United States. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Eclipses in History, brought to you by my partner, Norma Heiss, and myself. This series is intended to show the close connections between eclipses, scientific discovery, and society. In this and in our future episodes, Norma and I will be interviewing leading scientists and historians from around the world to bring you the full picture concerning eclipses, one of nature's most amazing and inspiring phenomena.